Hey everyone, my name is Dr. Ray Pastor, and today I'm going to talk about the multimedia principle and really including multimedia in training and how much it really matters. So a few years ago, I started asking myself this question, what is the return on investment of developing multimedia? How much does it really matter? For example, developing just text for training materials is pretty cost effective, because hiring someone to develop graphics can be very time consuming. So this idea that we should create multimedia with text and graphics had me asking myself, well, what is the return on investment? How much does making this from text to this, glorious multimedia, presentation, how much does it really matter? How much more are my learners learning? So I set out to do that. So the first thing I did is I started to look at the research and see what was out there. And I created this study that I developed called the Multimedia Principle, a meta-analysis on the multimedia principle in computer-based training. And I specifically asked myself, how much does the multimedia principle matter when learners are on the computer, when adult learners are on the computer? Because I cared about corporate training, this really return on investment of development time and development money. For those of you that aren't familiar with what a meta-analysis is, that means I looked at a number of studies on the topic, tried to get all of them to determine, what is kind of the general consensus among all these studies. So I'm going to kind of go through this study. For those of you that are watching, I have my paper pulled up and I'm going to kind of go through some stuff. For those that are listening, I'm going to kind of read. So basically what I did is, I tried to determine how much does it matter? That was really my question. How much does the multimedia principle matter? How much does including text and images in instruction matter versus just including text? That's really what I wanted to know. So first, let me talk a little bit about the background of this topic for those of you that aren't familiar. So first of all, what is this multimedia principle? And for those of you interested in learning about this stuff more, please go ahead. I'm just going to briefly talk about some of the lit review I did to kind of get to my question. But the multimedia principle is the idea that text and images are better for learning than just text or images alone. So text and images combined on a screen are better for learning than just text. Basically, what that means is that if I present someone with just text, and then I present a group of people with text and images, those with text and images on average should do better. So my question was really, how much better do they do? And I found a few different responses to that question. But basically, and I'm just scrolling through my paper here, what I found is I found two different things. So when I asked that question, I found a meta-analysis done in the late 90s on Dwyer and colleagues' research. For those that aren't familiar with Dwyer, Dwyer in the 60s, 70s, 80s wrote hundreds of papers studying really multimedia and the effects on it. But he was using paper. He wasn't using a computer. So a lot of his research was really on the effects of those representations, but just in a paper format. Then later in the 90s and 2000s, we have Richard Mayer's work. And Mayer's work was on the computer. And so there were some different findings between these. So a meta-analysis on Dwyer's work has found that there really isn't a significant difference in multimedia on high-level knowledge, but there was on low-level knowledge. So what Dwyer's research found was that multimedia, the idea that images and text versus text do make a big difference when you have low-level knowledge, like factual, recall kind of knowledge. But for high-level knowledge, that's the problem solving, the transfer. There was not a difference in his studies. Now, we look at Mayer and colleagues' work, and they did find a difference for both levels. They found a large difference. So my question really was, okay, well, if I break this research down, focused on computer-based training, because that's what companies are focusing on right now is computer-based training. There's so much money invested into it. I also focused on adult learners because a lot of studies are using children or they're using international, audiences. And I wanted to focus on American English speaking, computer-based training because that's where I'm based. So that's what I cared about for this study. So I started to try to find all the studies that looked at computer-based training. So that had to be on the computer. All the studies that used adult learners, English native speaking learners, adults, computer-based training. And that's where I began. So I started to go through and find every single study that I could on this. I looked in all the databases. I looked in Google Scholar. I asked colleagues. I asked experts on the topic. I had people going through and saying, find me studies that meet my criteria. Some other criteria that I had when I went through, I did require that they had given learners a prior knowledge pretest. Otherwise, if they didn't give them a pretest, there could have been differences or not differences, but the groups might have been different. So I didn't really trust those kind of studies. I also didn't trust studies that were just like a dissertation but never published. You had to have published these findings. So I looked at only published findings. And what I was surprised to find, so out of let's say I started with about well over 100 studies, broke that down to about 45 studies that seemed to meet my criteria. When I went through those 45 studies and analyzed them further, what I found was that either they didn't use computer-based training, they didn't use adult learners, or they didn't have a pretest. So I had to eliminate all of those. And what I came up with were only 5 studies. So the first real big finding that I was completely surprised at in this endeavor that I undertook. And I was working with some colleagues on this project too. It wasn't just me. But the first real big finding that we had was that there hasn't been a lot of research on this topic. There's been a lot of research on multimedia, but we haven't really looked a lot at adult learners. We haven't looked at computer-based training. We haven't always looked at English-speaking people. And when we did the studies, we might not have had a pretest to even measure the prior knowledge of people, so we didn't know if our groups were even. So that was my first big finding. And if you're listening and you're an expert on multimedia, you might be saying to yourself, no way, there's a lot more studies out there. I challenge you to go find them. Go look at my research paper, find the studies I did find, and find others that meet my criteria, because I couldn't. And it wasn't just me. I challenged other researchers out there in the field who literally laughed when I told them I could only find 5. And they said, no way, there's a lot more. And I told them to go find them, and they could not. Now, keep in mind, if this was done in 2016. So if it's now 2018, and you're like, well, hey, there's all these, in 2017, all this stuff was published. Well, I wasn't looking at that time. Those were published after when I was looking. It's just not out there. It's not there. We had 5 studies. Okay. The next interesting thing that I was going to do, and I'm going to scroll for those of you looking at my mouse. I'm actually scrolling over the study. So the next thing I looked at when I actually went through all of these studies is I looked at, did the authors in those 5 studies report reliability evidence and validity evidence for their study? So what does that mean? For those of you that aren't familiar. So basically the idea of reliability is that over time, if people were to continue to take the test, there would be consistency among the results. So let's see here. 1, 2, 3, 4. So 4 of the 5 studies did report validity or reliability evidence. Okay, so I was happy about that. But 1 didn't. So should I even use that study? Well, now I'm dropping it down to 4, so I have to use these 5. But I'm reporting that they did not report reliability evidence, which is not a good sign. I'm not quite sure why in the publishing world we're publishing papers that don't have reliability and validity evidence on a test. So we need to have that kind of stuff. All right. Validity evidence. Only 2 had validity evidence. So 2 of the 5 studies had validity evidence, which means that 3 of those 5 studies didn't have an expert review their content or their assessment or any of their materials for validity. So how do we know that their materials were even good? So now we're taking the results of their study and looking at them and saying, well, you did the study, but I don't even know what your results mean because you didn't have an expert review it. Or maybe they did do all of that, but they didn't report it in their paper. So if they didn't report it, I can't assume that they did it. So now the main problem with that reliability and validity evidence that I'm talking about right now is that only one study out of the 5 had both reliability and validity evidence. Only one. I don't know how these other papers got published, but they did. Unless maybe the editor knew that the reliability and evidence was done. It just isn't reported in the paper. I'm not quite sure. But they were published. So we have 5 studies. We really only have one study that has any validity and reliability evidence. It has both of those. And has a pretest. And is on adult learners. And is in computer-based instruction. That was it. So I was really surprised. That was the biggest thing that I found in this study. Just shocked me. All right, so then what I did is I wanted to look at high-level learning and low-level learning. So low-level is like recall, like memorization. And high-level learning is like transfer and problem solving. That deep learning that we really care about. So what are the results? What did I find? All right, for those of you watching here. So overall, are multiple representations better for learning than computer-based training than single? So overall, yes. I did find a difference that overall for everything, there was a difference. How much of a difference? A medium effect size. But remember, for effect size, effect size only matters based on the case. So I can say something had a high or low effect size, but that's a meaningless thing to say unless I look at the circumstance. Because a low effect size, that's only like a really low effect of like 1%, could really be huge and meaningful to me. Or a high effect size, and it's a high effect, could really have no bearing on the research question. So you have to take effect size when someone says high and low into consideration with the circumstance. So here we had a pretty medium to high effect size for each one of these. So overall we had a 13% difference. And that's for low and high. So when I looked at low and high, so for low, I did have a difference. It was 13% as well, with a pretty good effect size. 13% difference when using multiple versus single for low. Now for high level learning, I did not find a significant difference. Agreeing with the findings of Dwyer's meta-analysis. I did not find a difference, but you have to remember I only had 5 studies to work with. So it's very hard to generalize those results. Had I had 50 studies, would I find a difference? I don't know. But, I didn't find a difference, but I did find that there was even though it wasn't significant, there was a 10% difference, which isn't much different than the other, which was 13. And it was a pretty high effect. So I have to look at that significant and non-significant and say, well, if I had more studies, it probably would have been significant and would be about a 10 to 13% difference. So overall, what did I find? My overall conclusion of this study is that multimedia does produce a difference. That difference is what I've found in computer-based training with adult learners, around 10 to 13% of a difference. So the real question you have to ask yourself, is it worth the extra money to develop out images for a 10 to 13% difference? I can't answer that question for you. And you also have to take into consideration how do images, what is their effect on my employees' motivation? And how does that affect the motivation? And how does that affect the look and feel? And how long are these people looking at this for? And all those kind of questions are going to go into that equation for you. But overall, if someone asks you, well, how much does, versus us giving them just text and giving them these images with the text, what is the difference in achievement? And it's going to be around a 10 to 13%. At least for computer-based training and adult learners. And those were my findings of my meta-analysis. So I've set out to kind of do a little bit more research, kind of the what's next. We really need more studies on this topic. The topic of multimedia has been studied to death, but we have not looked at it in specific cases, specifically computer-based training in adult learners, where we're spending all the money implementing it. That's where all the studies should be. Unfortunately, we don't do that because it's not as easy to find the participants. A lot of the studies were done with children or done overseas, or they didn't use computers, and it's tough to generalize those results to computer-based training and adult learners with people who are paid to have to learn what they're. I'm training my workforce on this. They have to learn it. So that's a different type of audience. So we really need to focus on that in some cases, specifically for the multimedia principle. So I have done a study, a follow-up to this, which was a general multimedia study on that specific audience, which I'll talk about in another video podcast. But I really think that, that's a good direction to go in. As far as our research, because it's really going to help companies determine, is that return on investment worth it? Thank you.